поспішимо, доме тепло, ой, любі, даймо, і весело.
Шановні телеглядачі, ми вітаємо вас в гостях у школи імені Лесі Українки. Від усього нашого педагогічного колективу, від адміністрації школи, від учнів і батьків школи. Дозвольте привітати вас з різдвяними святами. Ми бажаємо вам щиро, від усієї душі, міцного здоров'я, щастя, успіхів в усьому, миру в душі, миру в сім'ї, ясного і мирного неба над головою. Нехай щастить вам. Дякую.
Темна нічка за шибками, сон на крилах вже летить. Небеса блищать зірками, а Івасик ще не спить. У голівці сонні мрії, хмари, небо, зорі, рай, білі ангели лілії, а між ними Миколай.
Ой, хто Миколая любить, ой, хто Миколая служить, тому святий Миколай, на всякий час помагай Миколаю, тому святий Миколай, на всякий час помагай Миколаю. Ой, хто зміщить свої гори, на землі і морі, не напасти, не даш йому вийти впасти Миколаю. Не напасти, не даш йому вийти впасти Миколаю. Ой, хто Миколає ходить на полі, його призиває, Миколаю. Миколай, молися за нами, благає, тебе зі сльозами, ми забудем визволяти, ім'я Твоє величати навіки. Ми забудем визволяти, ім'я Твоє величати навіки. Ми забудем визволяти, ім'я Твоє величати навіки.
Різдвяна зірка на небо вийде. Малий Ісусик, хто дітей прийде. Малий Ісусик, кожа дитинка, буде святвечір, буде ялинка, буде колядка в кожній хатині, настане втіха в кожній родині. На столі свята вечеря, вся родина за столом, відчиняє ангел двері позолотистим крилом.
Ніч різдвяна, світла й чиста, небо серед ним на місці. Щастя і радості багато нам несе різдвяне свято. І щоразу воно нове, свято свят, Різдво Христове.
Yeah.
голову. Отак, молодці. Молодці. Крутіть, крутіть.
Можете підняти ручки, підніміть. Яка ангелина? Яка ангелина?
Ручки підніміть. Ручки підніміть. Ручки помахайте, помахайте, поцілуйте ручками. Помахайте, поверніться до мене і помахайтеся ручками. Поверніться до мене. Дівчатка, всі ручками махають. Всі помахали. Молодці, всі дивляться сюди. Сюди.
У мене не дає ні. У мене є на них.
Веселих свят! Різдвом Христовим!
Добрий день, діти. І сьогоднішній наш урок української літератури трошки незвичайний саме через те, що ми його поєднали з нашим музичним вихованням. І тема, котра сьогодні, це пісні зимового циклу. Ви потім запишете свої зошити. І також наші свята зимового періоду. І сьогодні наша вчителька, ви знаєте її, пані Леся Шевченко, нам допоможе провести цей чудовий і цікавий урок. Прошу вас.
Доброго дня, дітки. Давайте ми з вами спробуємо заспівати пісеньку, яку ми всі дуже любимо і знаємо. Пісню, з якою дітки ходять у нас співати на різдвяні вечора і просять Святого Миколая, щоб він їх оберігав, хоронив, допомагав і приносив гостинці, подарунки. Голосно слова ми знаємо всі. Ще раз.
Ой, хто Миколая любить, ой, хто Миколая служить, тому святий Миколай, на всякий час помагай Миколаю, тому святий Миколай, на всякий час помагай Миколаю. Ой, хто спішить твої твори, золотий, на землі і морі, все хорониш від напасті, не даш йому ріки впасти, Миколаю. Все хорониш від напасті, не даш йому ріки впасти, Миколаю. Ой, хто ньому прибігає, на поміч його призиває, той все з горя вийде ціло, охоронить душу й тіло Миколая. Той все з горя вийде ціло, охоронить душу й тіло Миколаю. Миколаю, молився за нами, благаєм тебе зі сльозами, ми тя будем вихваляти, ім'я Твоє величати навіки. Ми тя будем вихваляти, ім'я Твоє величати навіки. Ще раз. Ми тя будем вихваляти, ім'я Твоє величати навіки.
Гарненько сідайте, розфарбовуйте. Тільки спочатку один малюночок, а потім уже другий. Не все підряд. Варюшенька, сідай, будь ласка, рівненько і гарненько розфарбовуй. Дуже гарно. Беріть тільки різні кольори. І червоний, і зелений потрібен.
Або що?
Звичайно, і жовтий, ялиночка тільки зеленого кольору, правда?
А буває
Буває блакитного такого, буває світло-зеленого,
буває
темно-зеленого. Буває з білим, якщо снігом притрушена, звичайно.
Але білий
Але у Святого Миколая кожен
Boris, thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Now, what type of election occurred on October the 26th?
It was an election to the Rada, or the Ukrainian parliament. It was what's called a pozastrokovy, in other words, an election that wasn't planned. And the reason it was held was because of the change in government in Ukraine caused by the Maidan.
Were you a short-term or long-term observer?
I was long-term.
Can you explain to us what a long-term observer does?
Well, starting off with the whole purpose of the mission is really to observe the actual elections.
Okay.
So we bring in a whole bunch of short-term observers in the week before the election and prepare them to actually go out into the areas and observe what's happening. But somebody has to prepare the way for the short-term observers. And our job as long-term observers was to go out to the various oblasts, or roughly provinces, get to know them, get to know the political and social situation in them. Based on what we learned, brief the short-term observers and assign them specific areas to be in, and assign them specific tasks in terms of observation. So what we would do is we'd spend our days as long-term observers talking to community groups, to political groups, talking to local government, talking to the head of the oblast administration, the head of the oblast militia or police, the head of the security service for Ukraine, trying to get a feel for where problem areas might be, where areas of most interest for observers might be. And we'd spend our days talking to them, we'd spend our evenings writing reports of everything we'd seen. So we'd write a general daily report, we'd also write specific reports on incidents we saw, on political rallies we attended, those sorts of things.
And after the election's over, is there any work you do after that?
What we do is we write a report on the election itself, on what we observed. That goes in, well, actually I should go back just a little bit. The Canada mission I was part of, which was a Canada-Ukraine bilateral mission, sponsored by the Canadian government and paid by the Canadian government, had a very distinctive form of technology. We actually, on election day, worked with tablets. And we had pre-formatted reports, and as we visited each polling station, each pair of us would automatically fill in the report, send it in. So throughout the day, the central office in KO would have an ongoing series of reports on what was happening in the various polling sites, how they were being run, not so much how the people were voting, but how the voting was going. A very efficient, very well done operation. Then at the end of the process, which was probably around 48 hours after the beginning of the election, voting, we'd send in qualitative reports based on what we saw, amplifying what came in on the reports we did on the tablets. Then we'd be brought into KO, and there would be again qualitative reporting, and we'd sit and we'd discuss what we'd seen, and the analysts that were part of the central operation would sort of take notes, listen to us, and that would become part of the final report of the mission.
Boris, when did you arrive in Ukraine?
Arrived there just at the end of September.
Now, basically, I think the youth, you spend some time in Kiev, and then you went off to the area where you were going to be doing the work. What part of Ukraine were you sent to?
I and my partner, Miron Homeniuk, were in western Ukraine, Chernivtsi Oblast, which is right up against the Romanian border, and Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast, which is just north of that.
Typically, what kind of areas? Is that agrarian, or is there any industry there?
The basis is agrarian. Fairly rural communities, forestry, folk crafts, that sort of thing. They used to be very much centers of high technology. They had a very strong military industry there under the Soviet regime. A lot of that has fallen apart, and they're trying to renew it now to develop profit-making businesses based on the very high level of workforce they have.
Now, is that a predominantly Ukrainian-speaking area, or is it mixed?
Ivano-Frankivsk is the most Ukrainian of all the oblasts. Chernivtsi is a bit different. It's got a high percentage, well, about 20% Moldovan Romanian, and a fairly high percentage of Russians, 8 or 10%, I think. The language you hear on the streets is a mixture of a number of languages in both oblasts. It tends to be predominantly Ukrainian, but you do hear a lot of Russian. And the interesting thing is, unlike our perceptions here and our sort of thinking here, there's no conflict over language in Ukraine. People are very flexible. Whatever language you speak in, they'll try and reply to you in that language. They'll make accommodations. Even the refugees from the east have no difficulty in fitting into those two oblasts.
With the election itself in Ivano-Frankivsk, Chernivtsi, how would you say it was fair and transparent?
Well, I think our report, that is the report of the mission itself, probably phrased it the right way. The results of the election were a true reflection of the will of the Ukrainian people. And I would say that's sort of spot on. That's exactly what they were.
Good. What was the mood of the voters at the time of the election?
That's difficult because you have different moods, different people, depending who you're dealing with. Overall, I would say there's a mood of great expectation. The expectations are so high on the newly elected government that it may be difficult for the government to meet them. The people have had 20 years of attempts at reform, of corruption, of theft at the highest levels, of political corruption. They want change, and they want change immediately. And no government, I think, can actually live up to those expectations. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens within the next year or two.
Now, when you're talking about expectations, would that be more of a shift towards, say, Europe and the West?
Oh, very much so. I mean, that's the whole Maidan protest began over a refusal of Yanukovych to sign the treaty with the European Union. So that was the basis of it. But I think it goes way beyond that. It's the EU is almost a magic talisman, and they talk about being Western, about being part of the EU. They're talking about a complete change in the thinking in government, a complete reform of government, getting rid of corruption, straightening out the justice system. Massive tasks, things that in Canada took us 30, 40, 50 years to do after we won our own independence. They're expecting to do within days, weeks, and months. Plus, of course, they have a war going on.
Now, also, too, is there a feeling that there's some impetus to join NATO?
There wasn't much talk of it during the election. The only thing I saw were polls that said, I think now very close or at the majority of people want to join NATO, which is very different from what it was even a couple of years ago, where it was only 15 to 20%.
When you were there, what was the impact of the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine on the mood of the people at election time?
Well, I think there were two sets of impacts. The first ones in terms of the election were very narrow, and there were refugees. And not refugees, but what are called internally displaced people. People from Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk who'd left the areas because of the war. There are about 2,500 of them in Frankivsk, about 1,600 in Chernivtsi Oblast. And it was one of our issues was to make sure that, not to make sure, but to see if they got the right to vote and if they got access to voting. The other element I think the war has done on a much wider sort of social basis, is it's done more to unite Ukrainians and to give them a feeling of being Ukrainian than anything else that's happened in the past 20 years. There's a very strong feeling of Ukrainianism and nationalism in what we might call the small n sense. Not the nationalism of the 30s and 40s, but a new sense of Ukrainian patriotism, very strong.
And one closing question. How many people, how many long-term and short-term observers were there from the Canadian mission?
We had just under 200 altogether.
And I imagine were any of them able to get into the occupied area in the east or not?
During the presidential elections, there were teams, this is the ones that were held last May. There were teams assigned to those areas and they actually got in there. One of our teams was actually at a polling station when the little green men came in to disband it and chase everybody away. This time, it was the same teams, went to the same areas, but they couldn't get into and even didn't try and get into the occupied areas. They just stayed in those oblasts in the areas, in the free areas, the areas under Ukrainian control.
Boris, thank you very much. It's a very illuminating interview, and thanks for coming.
My pleasure, Ron. Anytime.
Good. Until next time, Christos Rosdaitche.